It's the early 1960s. America is a nation split between its promise and its hypocrisy. The air hums with tension, freedom songs on one side, police sirens on the other. And in the middle of it all stands a man, sharp suit, sharper mind, his eyes burning not with anger alone, but with truth unfiltered. Malcolm X, a man who refused to whisper when the world demanded silence. A man who turned pain into poetry and oppression into oratory. A man who taught millions that the first act of liberation is to speak your own name without fear. They called him dangerous. They called him radical. They called him a threat to peace. But history would one day call him what he truly was, a mirror. Because when Malcolm spoke, he didn't just describe the world, he reflected it. And the reflection was uncomfortable, unfiltered, and undeniably real. The birth of a voice to understand Malcolm X. We must travel further back into the long arc of black history. From the ships that tore millions from Africa's shores, to the plantations where dignity was stripped but spirit survived, the story of Malcolm X begins long before his birth. Born Malcolm Little in 1925, he grew up in a world that told him he was less than human. His father, a preacher who admired Marcus Garvey, was murdered for daring to speak of black pride. His mother, institutionalized after years of trauma and poverty. The state took the children. The system swallowed the family. Young Malcolm learned early the world was not built for him. He became a hustler, a thief, a prisoner, a product of the cage America called normal. But in prison, a transformation began. He discovered books. He discovered language. He discovered power, not of fists, but of thought. He read philosophy, history, religion, everything from Plato to Elijah Muhammad. And through those words, he forged a weapon more potent than any gun, his voice. Rebellion of the mind, Malcolm emerged from prison not as a broken man, but as a reborn one. He discarded the name Little, a slave name, he said, and claimed X. X was not just a symbol of loss, but of search, the unknown name of an identity stolen, yet to be reclaimed. When he spoke for the nation of Islam, his words cut like lightning through the fog of complacency. He told the oppressed, "You've been asleep too long." He told the powerful, "Your time of comfort is over." While others asked for integration, Malcolm demanded self-respect. While others begged for acceptance, Malcolm demanded accountability. He reminded the world that peace without justice is not peace. It's submission. And that is why his message resonated not just with black Americans, but with every human soul that had ever been silenced. Because at its core, Malcolm's philosophy wasn't about hate. It was about clarity. He didn't teach people to hate their oppressors. He taught them to stop hating themselves. The evolution of resistance, but Malcolm was not a static figure. He was a living contradiction, constantly evolving, constantly questioning. When he left the Nation of Islam, it wasn't a betrayal, it was a metamorphosis. He had seen the limits of ideology. He wanted truth, not tribalism. And when he traveled to Mecca, he saw a vision that shattered his earlier beliefs. He prayed beside men with blue eyes and brown skin. He saw Muslims of every color united in worship, and he realized the real struggle was not black versus white, but justice versus power, truth versus ignorance. Malcolm returned to America changed, not softer, but deeper. He spoke now not only of black liberation, but of human liberation. Yet, this evolution made him dangerous to both his enemies and his former allies. The system fears no one more than the man who can't be bought, silenced, or confined to a label. The voice of the voiceless, Malcolm's genius lay not in his anger, but in his articulation. He gave form to feelings that had no language. He turned centuries of humiliation into sentences that demanded to be heard. He told the poor man he was more than his poverty. He told the enslaved mind it could free itself through knowledge. He told the forgotten child of Harlem, "You are not what they told you you are." And when he spoke, even his enemies listened. Because beneath the fire, there was precision. A historian's logic wrapped in a revolutionary's passion. That's what made Malcolm X a cosmic figure in the history of human consciousness. He didn't just fight for his people. He expanded what it meant to be human. The revolution of respect, that was the word that defined his life. Not charity, not pity, not tolerance, respect. The demand that a human being be treated as a full participant in the story of civilization. And that is why Malcolm X remains eternal. Because in every age, there are those who kneel and those who stand. And he taught the world that dignity begins the moment you rise. The tragedy, of course, is that history often silences its prophets. In 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom, Malcolm X was assassinated. But the bullet did not end the movement. It amplified it. Because ideas don't die when bodies fall. They multiply. They evolve. They echo across generations. And that echo still lives in every voice that dares to speak truth to power. History rarely moves in straight lines. It bends, folds, and redefines itself through men like Malcolm X. Men who burned so brightly they forced the world to see what it had ignored. By the early 1960s, America stood at a crossroads. The civil rights movement preached nonviolence. Dr. King called for love and reconciliation. But Malcolm demanded reality. He said, "You can't have peace where there is no justice." And that single sentence tore through the illusion of America's moral comfort. He made people uncomfortable, not because he lied, but because he refused to. He stripped away the myth of progress and exposed the raw truth that freedom, without power, is an illusion. The anatomy of power. Malcolm X understood something most reformers did not. That oppression isn't merely physical. It's psychological. It lives in how people see themselves, how they are taught to dream, how they are made to forget. He once said, "Who taught you to hate yourself?" That question wasn't rhetoric. It was revolution. Because before you can break chains on your hands, you must break the chains on your mind. He urged his people to re-educate themselves, to read, to study, to own their history. He warned that the media would make the oppressed look like the villains and the oppressors like the heroes. And he was right, terrifyingly right. Every empire sustains itself not only through weapons but through stories. Malcolm X sought to rewrite the story. He transformed the narrative from victimhood to victory, from "why shall overcome someday" to "we are overcoming now." Fire and philosophy, unlike the romantic idealists of his time. Malcolm's mind was surgical. He dissected history like a scholar, yet delivered truth like a storm. He combined intellect and emotion, data and defiance. He saw the black struggle as part of a global resistance. The same spirit that moved African liberation, Asian revolutions, and anti-colonial wars. To him, Harlem and Hanoi were not separate battles. They were reflections of the same moral conflict, the human demand to live free. He once declared, "We are not outnumbered, we are out-organized." And that became his mantra, not just for black Americans, but for all oppressed people. Malcolm X was not calling for violence, he was calling for self-respect under siege. He didn't want blood, he wanted balance. He didn't want revenge, he wanted restoration. And that is why his ideas terrified both racists and politicians alike, because he revealed that true revolution doesn't begin in the streets. It begins in the soul. The journey to Mecca, then came the pilgrimage, the Hajj that would redefine his destiny. In Mecca, Malcolm saw what America refused to show him: equality not as an ideal, but as a lived reality. He saw white men and black men eating from the same bowl, sleeping on the same ground, praying to the same God. He saw color dissolve in the unity of faith. And for the first time, Malcolm realized that racism wasn't inherent to humanity. It was a disease born of history. It could be unlearned, reformed, transcended. He wrote, "I have seen with my own eyes the brotherhood of all colors." What America needs is Islam, not in the narrow sense of ritual, but in the universal sense of justice. The firebrand had become a philosopher. The nationalist had become a humanist. The rebel had become a bridge. But in that transformation lay his fate. Because when a man outgrows the chains that define him, both his enemies and his allies turn against him. Enemies in the shadows, Malcolm's rise was meteoric, and so was the fear it inspired. The FBI tracked him. The Nation of Islam turned cold. Every speech he gave became an act of defiance against death itself. He knew they were coming. He said, "It's a time for martyrs now, and if I am to be one, it will be for the truth." There's a tragic beauty in that kind of awareness. When a man continues to speak, knowing that every word brings him closer to his end. That's what courage looks like when stripped of romance. And yet, even under threat, his message expanded. He began to build bridges with African leaders, with revolutionaries in Ghana, Egypt, and Nigeria. He spoke of unity beyond borders, beyond color, beyond creed. He was building a global consciousness before the term even existed. That's why his voice couldn't die in Harlem. It belonged to the world. The Last Days, February 21st, 1965. Audubon Ballroom, New York City. Malcolm X stood before an audience preparing to speak his final speech. His wife Betty and their daughters were in the crowd. Then gunfire, chaos, 3 assassins, 15 bullets. The man who had carried truth like a torch through darkness fell before the very people he sought to free. But listen, this is where history often misunderstands him. Malcolm X did not die because he hated. He died because he refused to hate selectively. He refused to confine his vision to one tribe, one color, one doctrine. He spoke of humanity itself, and that, to the corrupt, was unforgivable. Legacy of the unbowed decades later, his image still divides and inspires. But the truth is, Malcolm X wasn't a saint or a sinner. He was a seeker. He sought identity when the world offered shame. He sought clarity where the system offered confusion. He sought liberation where the law offered obedience. And in doing so, he became the voice of the voiceless, not just for a generation, but for eternity. Malcolm X showed us that progress is not polite. It does not whisper. It roars. It confronts, disrupts, dismantles, and rebuilds. He reminded us that silence is not neutrality, it's compliance. And that to be human is to speak even when your voice shakes. Because resistance, at its purest, is not an act of defiance. It's an act of existence. History, in its ruthless honesty, tests every generation with the same question: will you conform or will you confront? Malcolm X confronted. And in doing so, he redefined what it means to be free. Freedom for him was not a gift handed down by the powerful. It was a right reclaimed by the courageous. He believed that every human soul carried within it a natural sovereignty, a kingdom of dignity that no law, no whip, no prejudice could destroy. He said, you can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. That single idea became his sword and his shield, because Malcolm understood something that empires fear, that ideas are more dangerous than armies. You can jail a man, but not his truth. You can kill a body, but not a movement. And the moment he fell, his words became immortal. The voice that wouldn't die. After his death, they tried to bury him in silence. But silence became the echo chamber of his message. The ghettos that once whispered his name now shouted it from murals and marches. The universities that once ignored him began to study him. And the very system that feared him began to quote him. That's the paradox of power. You can't kill an idea that has already taken root in consciousness. Malcolm X didn't simply inspire resistance. He institutionalized it. He made pride an act of rebellion. He made intelligence an act of defiance. He made truth an act of war against ignorance. And in doing so, he created a blueprint not just for black liberation, but for every human being trapped under the weight of oppression. He showed that to resist is not to destroy, it is to restore. Black pride as a mirror to humanity. Let's talk about that. Black pride. To the uninformed, it sounded separatist. To Malcolm, it was salvation. Because how can a people contribute to humanity when they've been taught to despise their own reflection? Malcolm X's call for black pride wasn't about supremacy. It was about psychological repair. It was a demand that the world recognize the beauty, creativity, and genius that centuries of racism tried to erase. He told his people, "We were here before your ships, before your chains, before your lies." That wasn't arrogance. That was archaeology of the spirit. He was digging through layers of history to uncover buried greatness. He made Afrocentricity not a trend, but a theology of self-belief. He turned self-love into political warfare. And in that, he spoke to more than just Black America. He spoke to all humanity. Because every group, every individual, at some point, faces a system that tells them to shrink. Malcolm's message was simple: don't. Stand tall. Speak loud. Define yourself. Resistance of voice. The phrase resistance of voice, it's not just poetic, it's prophetic. Because every revolution begins as a whisper, and every empire falls to an echo. Malcolm X understood that silence is the final victory of oppression. So he spoke, not with the softness of diplomacy, but with the fire of truth. He turned the microphone into a weapon, the stage into a battlefield, and his words into liberation hymns. Each speech was a lightning bolt cutting through the storm of lies. Each sentence carried the moral voltage of centuries of suffering turned into strength. And that's why he remains timeless, because oppression still wears new faces. It still hides behind systems, algorithms, economies, and laws, but so does resistance. And every time a young man or woman stands up and says, "I refuse to be less than what I am," that's Malcolm X reborn. The echo through generations, from Harlem to Johannesburg. From Detroit to Dakar, his influence crosses oceans. You can hear his cadence in hip-hop lyrics, his fury in activist speeches, his vision in classrooms, and his discipline in community builders. He became the grammar of modern resistance, because he taught that power respects only power, and that knowledge, unity, and self-respect are the first weapons of the free. His life is a reminder that revolutions don't end with the revolutionaries. They evolve. They adapt. They reincarnate. Malcolm X is not a figure of the past. He is a pattern in history. A signal that emerges whenever injustice becomes normalized. And if you listen closely, that signal is rising again. The philosopher of fire, David Christian, would call this the universal rhythm of complexity. When systems break down under the weight of inequality, and new orders are born from the ashes, Malcolm X embodied that moment. He wasn't just reacting to history, he was reshaping it. He forced America to confront its contradiction. that it called itself the land of the free while building itself on bondage. He forced humanity to ask whether morality can exist without equality. He forced us, all of us, to look inward and ask, am I free or merely comfortable? And that's why his words sting even today, because they expose complacency as the enemy of justice. He knew comfort kills revolutions, and he refused to be comfortable in a world still built on chains. The standing ovation moment. So what does Malcolm X mean now? He means that truth once spoken cannot be silenced. He means that pride once awakened cannot be enslaved. He means that freedom once tasted cannot be forgotten. Malcolm X is not gone. He's in every voice that dares to speak truth to power. He's in every classroom where history is retold from the eyes of the oppressed. He's in every protest chant, every unflinching act of self-definition. He is the eternal echo of resistance. The proof that words, when wielded with integrity, can outlive bullets. And so, when the world asks again, who will stand? Who will speak? Let the answer thunder from every corner of the earth. We will. Because Malcolm X taught us that the most radical act in a broken world is to love yourself enough to never kneel again.